am thrilled to be talking today with Elaine Miller-Karas. She's the key developer of a very helpful model called the Community Resiliency Model, and actually has a book called Building Resiliency to Trauma that talks about how helpful this model is to apply to all of our lives. So I'm thrilled to have her today. In fact, it's been such an important piece of work that the United Nations actually named it as one of the innovations helping meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to being an author and developer of this model, she's also the co-founder and the director of the Innovation of the Trauma Resource Institute. She also consults with Emory University. They have an SEE learning program that was launched and inspired by His Holiness. I mean, who says that, Elaine, right? His Holiness, the Dalai Lama.
It does sound like, oh my goodness, really?
Really, I know, on top of that.
Project. Oh my gosh, yes.
And she also has her own podcast called Resiliency Within. So I'm so thrilled, Elaine, that you're here. I'm a big fan of your work. We were just talking about how I use your work in my life, my professional and personal life. So thank you so much for being here.
You're so welcome. I'm really excited to be here with you today and to share our ideas together about how we move through the world as women.
Absolutely. So let's start there, Elaine, because as women of color and thinking about our roots, and you as a young girl, did you dream that you would be focusing on trauma, that you would be writing a book? How did that tie in from going back?
I didn't know I was going to be doing those things. But when I have reflected upon my life, my mother and grandmother immigrated to the United States from El Salvador. In fact, I have the photo behind me that is actually the family picture from El Salvador that's very dear to me. But when I was 11 years old, I went to El Salvador for the first time. And what I grew up, I would say an advantage in a area of the Bay Area where I never saw poverty. And when I went to El Salvador, I saw poverty for the first time. And I remember seeing a mother holding a baby and thinking how I wanted to help that mother and baby if there was some way, I could give them money or help them find food. But, as a little girl, I'm thinking these things. I'm not saying this to my relatives. And I was there also without my mom and my grandmother. I was there all by myself with my mother's very beloved relatives. So I didn't say anything about it, but that memory is so seared into my very being that I think it inspired something in me that was almost unconscious. Mm-hmm. That, here I was in another country being, raised in the Bay Area and seeing this for the first time. And then for me to kind of naturally evolve as a human being and decide I wanted to become a social worker. And what do social workers do? They're on the ground. They're working with people who, for very variety of reasons, haven't had the same advantage. And because I lived in California, I went to a school specifically that was dedicated to working with the Mexican American residents of the state, and really was broadened to all the Latinx, as we call them now. I see myself as a Latina, but that was really important to me because I saw the suffering that my mom and grandmother had, and it was a suffering that was not spoken. And I think you probably know that, Analiza, right? When you come from a family that immigrates to another land, there are many things that they came away from, that they came to, that they didn't want to share. And so as I learned more about their lives, I also realized that the suffering that had happened, and the suffering that also, and I'm going to call it transgenerational trauma. And when I think about it, my mother was her grandmother. In fact, I'm going to show you the photo because I just love it so much. And if you look at the center, see the center of the photo, there's the elder woman. Her name was Magdalena. And Magdalena was my great grandmother. My mom is this person here. This is my grandmother here. And so when I see this generations, 3 generations of women in my family, Magdalena never married my great grandfather because she was a Mayan from Guatemala. And my great grandfather was a Spaniard. And so they had all these children together, but they were never married. And what was so interesting, and I guess the generations, my grandmother ended up having my mother out of wedlock. And then my mother had her first child out of wedlock. So when you see the generations of that,
Mm-hmm.
I really do think it has to do with that mark of colonialism and who was entitled and who was not. And so I share that very personal story because I think has a very important context of growing up in families where there's secrets, where there's been a moving to a new land, when they've come with not speaking English. In fact, I'm named Elaine because my mother worked pouring coffee at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. And the person who taught her English was a waitress named Elaine. And so, I mean, I think, but in any event, getting back to those kind of roots, there were many things that happened in our family and many secrets that I think to this day continue to make an imprint on our family that had to do with what happened, many, many years ago in El Salvador.
I mean, Elaine, when we talk about generational trauma, it's not part of the curriculum. Even if you do some of the meditation curriculum, you might do an ancestry meditation, but there's more to our current experience that I personally did not know until, and the secrets. And even if I ask now, there's not oblivion, because that's not the right word, but to say like nothing happened. It's all fine. It's all meant to be, which while I love that positive outlook to what's happened in the past, there's also the sense of, I can't share it. What's the value in sharing it? And I think that makes it harder to heal. So I guess when you hear me share that, and when you share your stories of generational trauma and how your work connects to supporting, healing, addressing it, I'd love to hear about that because it's so powerful to have a photo with 3 generations of women.
And it is connected because, for example, I would say that my mom had some mental health conditions. I mean, and, I can look back to some of the things that happened, during my growing up, and I have, understanding and kind of forgiveness for the things that have happened. But I think the reason why she didn't access necessarily mental health practitioners was because it was not in her context. Because part of our family culture was keep it in the family, do not share outside the family. And it was, so steeped in shame. And I think some of that shame is transgenerational shame of, growing up in mixed races between the Spaniards and also the indigenous cultures. And I understand that now, but I didn't understand it then. But my mother was also very Catholic, and she, she had her rosary beads. She went to church every day. If the priest would have said to her, "Oh, Elsie, there is a class about well-being after Mass today. You may want to come to that class, and it makes people stronger and families stronger." And I think that's what the Community Resiliency Model does. But you understand that it wasn't designed for emancipated individuals. But so much of the Western approach to psychotherapy, for example, is really designed for emancipated individuals going to see a private individual therapist. It's not designed for the community, which I think the Community Resiliency Model is exactly that. Because if you learn those wellness skills, and there's, by the way, many people who have integrated the wellness skills in little classes, workshops in faith communities around the world, is that is something that as you cultivate your well-being, you can share it with your children and with the elders in your family, is that it really is a community of well-being then. And, we talk about stress contagion. I like to talk about well-being contagion, because when it's kind of that proverbial dropping that little pebble in the stream and seeing those concentric circles go out. I think that's what happens when we cultivate and we learn about how we can expand our well-being. And that doesn't mean, the practices, let's say, of my mom, the rosary, which I actually loved saying the rosary myself. And so that is a practice that I know that when she practiced that, she had an experience of well-being. And so if you're practicing the rosary or any kind of ritual for your particular faith, and you notice what's happening inside your body, it actually magnifies your well-being. So we're not taking away, we're adding to, if that makes sense, adding to all the rich culture and traditions that exist around the world, and say, what would it be like if you added some other ingredients to it, and maybe some other skills that is, again, not taking away, but adding to.
I love that we're already using what we have, and that these are one, skills that can be used across generations, but two, that we can and leverage even prayer, religion to
Exactly.
notice and amplify. And that in your work, Elaine, talking about adverse childhood experiences, the ACE score, if we think about those questions, you also include in your work racism, prejudice. And I want to actually go back because your story is so powerful about your aunt, your uncle not having gotten married, the Spanish, your uncle being Spanish, your aunt being of indigenous Mayan heritage. And I want to talk about that because there's a piece of generational trauma, then there's a piece of colonialism that's often not spoken about. And not only that, but we don't go deeper to say, well, what did I actually internalize? So here's what happened in history. Okay, so we didn't get married. I'm going to share that with you. And that had an impact on what I believe about myself. So I'd love to go there because especially when we think about the Latinx culture, even Latin A, it's evolving into not wanting to, pigeonhole in terms of gender. I'm wondering, Elaine, what's your view on thinking about Latinx, Latina, is a Latina yourself, and having that identity of indigenous versus
Yes.
Latin? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it was my great grandmother and my great
Okay.
grandfather.
Okay.
So when I think about that, I do think there was an embodied shame. Well, just think about that, how you're supposed to be married, even within the Catholic Church. I just think it's so interesting. And I didn't even know the complete story. When I was 18, I went back to El Salvador again. And then I had a maiden, it was actually my mother's godmother, who told me the whole family history. And it was quite astonishing, actually, because I didn't know these things. And she, explained to me about the family and about, all the women not being married to the partner, to the fathers of their children. And with that society at that time, it was really very, there were the very rich and the very poor, but then there were the people that were in the middle, that were born to kind of the people of means, but didn't have status because of who their mother was. I was reading, when I went to El Salvador when I was 18, I was reading Tolstoy, and I'm going, this is really a lot like what I'm seeing right in front of me, right? Because I didn't realize that my mom, for example, that she was born into a family that had means, but she had no status, if that makes sense. So I think what happens, and I think that's happened to many families throughout the world, is I think there's an embodied shame. And I think that shame is part of what propelled my mom to leave the little village called Atiquisaya, where she was born, and come to the United States where she could start afresh. But she didn't really she didn't leave the shame behind. So if I said, oh, look I think that, my great grandmother, I think she looks like I think she was Mayan, Mom. And she said, oh no, she was Irish. I mean, if you look at the picture, she's clearly not Irish. And I've had my DNA done. I have 12% indigenous in my DNA from that region of the world. But you see, but why would she say that? Because the shame of being mixed race. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that she didn't love her grandmother, because she did, but there was such a shame of wanting to leave that behind, as if it was a scarlet letter. And so then you come to a new country, but you really haven't left the shame behind. So then it gets translated like, make sure that you're always dressed well. Make sure you're always saying proper language. Make sure. So you always are left with, I guess I'm just not quite right. Right? I'm not good enough. And how many times have we spoken to other women all around the world that are not good enough? And I also want to mention something else, because I know that your podcast is called Women of Color. It also, for me, as growing up with many colors in my family, I am very light-skinned like my mom. And so there also is that discordance between how I view myself and how and others view me. And I've obviously had advantage being a lighter skin Latina. But I think that also, if you saw my older sister, she has complexion like yours. There was all this thing about the color of our skin that also left a mark on all of us.
Yeah.
Like you're too light, or I wish I was darker. Like I wish I was like everyone else.
Right. And the idea of not fitting in, where am I? Where's a sense of belonging? While having the privilege of being white passing, there's also the internalized.
Well, and I think there's another part. My mother had a very heavy accent. And so we would go into stores, and I know many people have had this experience if their parents, if you're the first generation, and they would talk to me rather than my mom. As if somehow, because I didn't have an accent, that I was the more intelligible of the two of us. My mother would get very upset about it. And she was very outspoken. So she would go, talk to me. She's a little girl, which not everybody would do, right? And sometimes there isn't the advantage of your parent maybe speaking English well enough that children are often put in the role as the translator or the interpreter of what's going on. And so then you're placed in situations beyond yourself. But there was a lot of little microaggressions. Like I remember a person who became a very dear friend, she said to me, oh, I'm so sorry that your mother's an alcoholic, Elaine. I said, what? My mother's not an alcoholic. She goes, well, why does she talk so funny? I mean, she was like a little girl. She didn't know about accents. And she had moved to our community from Ohio. I guess there weren't many Latinxes or Latinas in Ohio, but when you're a little girl and you're hearing that, you're also there's all this other piling on of lumber of how people are saying you're somehow different.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back, building on your point, Elaine, to not feeling enough. And yes, often we chalk that up to, as women of color, first, we're not male, and then of color, we're not white. And then we have immigration, a history of immigration. Maybe we're born outside the country. Our parents had accents. We didn't quite fit in. We're assimilating. But as you think about your own story and even the research you've done, this not enoughness is pervasive, and it's really tough on the soul. No matter what you do, you still don't feel like enough. I mean, we both have Stanford degrees. I'm like, what? When is enough, right? And so I'm curious, talking about root cause, what else comes to mind for you as you think about this not enoughness and where it comes from?
Oh, that's a really good question. I wish I had all the right answers for that, Analiza. I don't know. I'll give you some impressions, but I certainly don't have all the answers. I think that if you grow up in a culture and that shame gets transported to another country, right? Mm-hmm. That shame becomes almost you swallow it. So it's like you're always striving to show that you belong. I belong here. I'm not an accident. I am a person who has thoughts and feelings and emotions and sensations, and my ideas matter. And so I think that when you have been in that position, and I think it starts with colonialism, right? The conquering of the Spaniards did horrible things, but people did horrible things all over the world. I've worked in parts of Africa and other parts of the world. We're seeing the ramifications of colonialization and how that gets involved in splitting people away from each other. Mm-hmm. And also with that worldview of I'm just not good enough. So if, like I said, if my skin was a different color, if my hair was different, if I was smarter, if I was a different gender, I mean, all those different things that go into the soup. So, I think that we inherently will swallow the suffering of our parents. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's conscious. It's an unconscious mechanism. So how do we get out of that? And for me, I was a very shy child as well. And I didn't know I had a voice. And, where did that come from? I certainly have had a voice in my adulthood, but, when I tell people, oh, I was frightened to speak in front of others. But I think part of that was like, if you speak, you could shame us. Does that make sense to you? If you speak, you could shame us. And, when I did my internship at Stanford, I mean, that's a perfect example. Oh my gosh, I'm chosen to do this internship here. It was really but then it was always like, oh, but I'm a fraud. They're going to know that they made a mistake to let me come and do my internship here, right? I don't know if you felt that too, Analiza, mm-hmm, like, mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. But, I've talked to so many people around the world, and I imagine you have too, that is an underlying belief of so many people. And they're telling me they don't feel good enough. I said, you're going to have to get a handle on that, because how many PhDs are you going to need to get to believe that you are smart enough or good enough?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and we've seen that in the world that we travel in. So, and I think part of my way of coming to a greater healing of myself has been when I learned more about how my body is connected to my thoughts and my feelings. So if you think about every thought and feeling, including one that I'm not good enough, has a corresponding sensation in the body. And I've actually done this. I said, Elaine, when you say you're not good enough, what do you notice happening on the inside? There might be a tightness, and there also might be a little bit of lightness. Now, if I decided to focus on the tightness, will that get less or more? It actually expands the tightness. But I'll say, okay, I'll pay attention to that lightness. When I pay attention to that, it has the amazing thing of letting go of the tightness. I take a deeper breath. I can feel myself as a whole, fully bodied person, mind, body, spirit. And then the amazing thing that happens, there are meanings that come. And the meaning that often comes is, oh, I am good enough. I've been a really good friend. I've been a good parent. I've been a fairly decent mom, and also I've been a decent friend and wife. And then all of a sudden I'm noticing what else is true, and not in a narcissistic way, but in an affirmative way, and saying that is true. I often say, what else could be true? And that's the other part that's true. And I don't relish anyone's suffering, but I think also that the suffering, it can be the foundation of our well-being. Mm-hmm. So if we hadn't had the suffering, maybe we wouldn't have the joy that comes from it, or the understanding of like the rich heritage that I grew up in, that still is very much a part of me, even though it's, I didn't grow up there, but it's embedded in me. I'm very proud. Look I have that photo. It always sits behind me. And I have this other photo. I should have, if I can, that is a photo that I actually found. It's of a Navajo woman, but it looks like my grandmother. When I saw that, I showed my siblings, and go, who does that? Oh, that looks like, we called her Licky, because they wanted me to call her Abuelita. And when I was 2, I came up with Licky, and she lived with Licky for the rest of her life. But that face is my grandmother's face. And I always loved that, because she would have held me in her arms and in her hands. And she's always behind me, even though she died in the late 80s. So she's always with me. So I guess that's the other part of, there's the embedded shame, but there's also the incredible endurance to leave. I always think, Analiza, to leave their country, to come someplace where you do not speak English, to say, this life may be better than the life I've left behind. Oh my, I don't know if I could do that. I have so much admiration for what they decided to do in their life, and what the advantage was for me. I was the first one in my family to go to college. My children are both college graduates. They both have advanced degrees. And so that now is continuing through the next generations. So I'm so proud of that. So if it wasn't for their stamina and their courage and their bravery, and in spite of, I could just see my mom, she was going to work in the shipyards. So I can't even imagine her working in the shipyards. She soon got a job pouring coffee at the St. Francis Hotel, which I think was better suited for her, right? She was kind of an elegant person. So I thought, wow, she did all that. She did all that for a better life for herself, that ended up being a better life for me and my siblings. And I want to tell you one story about her. She was really spunky, but she was really nervous about taking any test. And so she never got her citizenship. And she was, I think at that time, probably well into her 70s. And at that time, they were about to pass some heinous laws in California with people who had green cards. I said, Mom, why don't you just, I'll help you. And so I was living in Southern California, and she was in the Bay Area. So I flew up many times, and we went over and over that pamphlet of all the questions about how to become a citizen. So she finally decided that she would take the test. Oh my gosh, she was so nervous. So I flew up to the Bay Area. I went with her for the exam. And I mean, she dressed up, she looked really beautiful. And she went in, and I said, Mom, you're going to be fine. She comes out and she goes, I passed. I'm going to be an American citizen. And then she said, but I knew so much, and they only asked me one question. So She was upset that they didn't ask her everything that she knew. But I say that about her because she was really had a lot of pride of coming to America. Even before she got her citizenship, she was proud to be a person with a green card. And then when she actually got her citizenship, I mean, it was such an important milestone for her. And I'm so grateful that I was part of that journey with her. And my sister and my sister-in-law, we were all there together, had a party for her. It was a big deal. And I imagine many people who have come from other lands know about the big deal celebration when people get their citizenship. As hard as it is, to be an American these days, there's also advantage here that many people don't have in their countries of origin.
Elaine, when we think about this arc of your family and even how we apply it today into ourselves, I'm hearing a few things because I'm always about how can we take lessons and then think about application. This idea of not feeling good enough, not imposter syndrome, not worthy, is a pervasive ill that many of us share through capitalism and not fitting the standard that has been embedded in history from cultures of shame, in which we then inherit because it's in secrecy, and one to lift the hood and understand the system and also understand our own histories and that there was trauma and also a lot of beauty, that this sacrifice that our parents, grandparents, our elders made on behalf of, more often than not, about the family has allowed us now to have this conversation, to do the work. And in that work, there are strategies to interrupt generational trauma that include this community resiliency model, which is to ground ourselves in what is happening now, this mind-body connection, having the ability to choose which sensations to tune into. And it could be like, I'm so pissed, my back really hurts, let me just focus on my back. And then you amplify that. Or it could be, okay, well, I'm feeling some levity some tingling in my face or wherever the tingling is. And perhaps that makes me feel lighter. And then I build on that because as we know, wherever attention goes, energy flows. And so I want to just talk about these empowerment strategies because there are ways of changing, interrupting the trauma. And I want to ask you a question about this because sometimes I hear from people that it's a positive way of focusing on what's working and let's try to make ourselves feel better. There's a better narrative, but then don't we just bury what's happened and actually not try to heal that? I'd love to just get some perspective.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, and this is remember, I'm an old trauma therapist. I mean, I've been trained in so many different ways. And I was always trained that you would have to talk about your trauma in order to heal from what's happened to you. I've learned that's not the case. For some people, it is important that you're witnessed and heard, and it can be very empowering for someone to finally say, oh my gosh, I've had the same experience, or I hear you, I'm listening to you. But for others, whatever has happened to them, they may have told the story so many times that they don't want to tell it one more time. Or I've also worked with people because of what they did, part of their trauma. Let's say if you were a soldier in war, that you don't want to tell someone what you did because you're ashamed of it. Not only are you ashamed of it, but you don't want to re-traumatize yourself or someone else by telling the story. I honor that perspective of why someone may not want to share it, but at the same time, I'll say, if you want to share it, I'm here to listen. For some people, it's beneficial, and for others, it's not. So what I have learned is that we all have a nervous system. And it reacts pretty much the same way, whether we live in Tanzania, whether we live in the Philippines, whether we live in California, whether we live in New York, when we experience stress and trauma. But we're also, I think it's so important to know that we're designed for healing. But if we only, and you said it, and what you pay attention to flows, right? I use a garden metaphor because most places on earth know about gardens. Are there weeds in gardens all over the world? Yes. And if you plant vegetables and you want to have a hearty harvest, if you only watered the weeds in your garden, would your vegetables grow in the same way? Well, we know the answer to that. No, that wouldn't be, because we're not putting enough nourishment in that part of what we want to grow. And I say that we are also part of nature. And so if we want to expand our well-being, it's not that we're not leaning into the suffering and knowing that's happened to us. But then what else is true? Because so much of the way the West has designed interventions has been about us gaining insight into what's happened to us, saying, oh, it wasn't our fault, we can go forward. But that doesn't necessarily change the nervous system. So let's say if something happened to us when we were little, and there was a person with, let's say, a certain kind of cologne that attacked us. And so we went to therapy and we learned that that wasn't our fault, that we were there at that place at that time. We're feeling better. But you're in the grocery store and you're buying vegetables and someone with that same cologne walks by you. You're actually in a safe place, but all of a sudden your heartbeat starts to beat fast. You are terrified. You leave your groceries in the cart and you get into your car and you drive home and you don't even know why. It's because we have multisensory reminders that we hold, that part of our body holds to remind us of when we were having existential events. And when those reminders come in, our nervous system reacts as if the trauma could happen in the present moment. It's designed that way. It's actually pretty elegant, right? To keep us alive. But if we don't know about that system, it's called implicit memory. If we don't know that exists and that happens to us, we might think, I think I'm just crazy. I don't know why I left my grocery stores, all my groceries in there. And I don't even know what made that happen, because you may not have connected the smell of cologne to the reactions in your body. So that's when you say about the intercepting of experiences of trauma, that when we learn how, and we call it reading the nervous system, some people call it body literacy. In neuroscience, they're calling it interoceptive awareness, the ability to just notice what's happening in your body. And that when people learn, and they can actually expand their learning of paying attention, that they can have better control of their emotions, better impulse control. Because, for example, if there's one of my triggers happen to me, and I have, by the way, four ACEs, and I often will feel my ears getting hot. And that is my indicator that, oh, something could happen to me where I might feel that sense. So now when I feel, when I sense the hot ears, I know immediately at that time, I can feel my feet on the ground or my hand on the table. I can do one of the, we call them help now strategies, that maybe having a glass of water and all of a sudden my ears cool down, I'm back into my zone of well-being. Now, I haven't talked about what's happened to me, but I've helped my nervous system settle. And maybe later I'll have ideas going, I wonder why that happened, but I feel better now. And I might even say, right now I'm good enough. That could actually be a thought that I could have when we experience that well-being in the body. And I think that's been one of the most profound learnings, is that our sensations and cultivating, those, your garden, it's literally your garden of well-being, not only affects how we feel and sense ourselves, but what we think about ourselves and the world. And one of the surprising side effects, I didn't know that was going to happen when I first had this idea with some others to create the Trauma Resource Institute, that what happens, and at least as oftentimes people talking about shame, will have more self-compassion. And when you have more self-compassion, oftentimes there's greater self-forgiveness. And also, when I look at someone else who's suffering, or maybe who's perpetrated something against me, I have more compassion towards them. And so what if we all could learn how to do that? How might that change the world? In that, because compassion, the Dalai Lama, Jesus, the great, spiritual leaders of the world, Abdul-Baha, they all talked about compassion. And if we can cultivate that, and that it is possible. That's one of the reasons why I love the Sea Learning program at Emory University, because the idea of His Holiness was that, how are children learning how to be compassionate? If there's been, if organized religion isn't as present, if, families are disrupted, how do children learn that? And if we could have a curriculum that was available in all schools, accessible to all countries in many languages, how might that change children? And I have to say, I've seen it. And it's in many schools around the world, many continents. And children are learning how to track their nervous system. And they're learning lessons of compassion. One little girl said to me when I was in India in 2019, I had the joy of interviewing the children who had participated in Sea Learning on stage. And so my they asked me if I would ask them what they like best and what they would change. And so one little girl said, well, I really like chapter 2. Of course, that made me very happy. But she said, but chapter 2 should be chapter 1, because if you're not in your zone of well-being, it's very hard to be compassionate. And I thought, oh my gosh, that was like a 10-year-old. I mean, if a 10-year-old knows that, and if you can expand that outward, how might that change children? And children then change their families and their community, and that we have a more compassionate world. And one of the things I think that's heartbreaking to me about our news media, for example, is that we focus so much on all the horror in the world, and not all the goodness is happening in the world. Like, I belong to an organization called Catalyst 2030. And these are thinkers around the world that are really making some great efforts to think about the scalability of well-being, whether it's, solar, whether it's climate change, whether it's mental health, all these different, and these are folks that are working actively, starting nonprofits, NGOs in many continents, and really it's what else is true. But do we get enough attention on that? I don't think so, because of course, it's like the tragedies of the world, like this morning, waking up to yet another mass shooting in the United States. How we've had 57 so far. And of course, that gets the attention and needs attention in terms of how we mitigate that, how do we change that? But at the same time, then there's so many good projects that are working with people that are suffering that can help.
The expansiveness of the work that you do and your team does with the community resiliency model is astounding, because not only is it applicable to us adults, but it's applicable to our kids. And that quote you shared from that little girl, that when we stay in our states of well-being, that's our most loving selves. I haven't flipped my lid with my brain, and I can actually stay in dialogue and imagine what could happen when we pay attention to the beauty around us. I'm actually feeling lighter as I listen to this.
I'm so glad, because there's one other subject I want to make sure that we touch upon, and that's about being a woman and being a change maker. There are many people of however they identify in terms of non-binary, male, female, that embrace women's leadership. But there's a lot of systems that work to not embrace us. Mm-hmm. So I think that has been probably the hardest part of being a woman who's been a change agent, is coming up against what I'll just say patriarchal systems that are not necessarily set up to embrace women and women's gifts. And even in higher education, or in places where you would think, oh, well, America, we have, gender equality. Well, yes, to a point, but then there also is what the unconscious mechanisms of how people set up systems that still can be very oppressive towards women. And so I've had some experiences where I have met some of the great leaders of the field that I'm in, but I think part of it, in hindsight, certainly there can be errors in how we come forth sometimes. That happens to all of us. But I think that one of the things that we can't change, right? We show up as ourselves. And I identify as, a cisgendered woman, and a Latinx, and as a mother, a grandmother, a wife, a sister, I think a good friend. And yet I can approach someone who's in leadership, who has a lot of renown, thinking that they would be a person that would be embracing of new ideas and innovation, and find that may not be the case. And I found that with some men and even some women, because I think that this is a hard thing to even say, some of the worst misogynist behavior has been swallowed by women, that can be directed towards other women who are coming with ideas that are innovative to change the world. So I don't think it's over. Annalisa, I'd certainly love to get your impression about that, but I think it's something that we have to grapple with when we're a woman and we're a change agent.
Thank you for naming that. It's often not talked about, Elaine, this idea of being in these seats of, I'll call it power, because it is, that there comes a wall of racism and sexism, and surprisingly from people who have you would think would be most compassionate: women, white women, sometimes women of color. And it's so sad because the job is already hard and you're trying to do all this work, but then to face that, and hoping to make change for all of us, there's this barricade. And I don't know, Elaine, when you've done this work, besides trying to build your own resiliency, my own resiliency, to come back every day positive, how you found, one, how do you take care of yourself personally, Elaine, to keep coming back and knowing that's a possibility of being treated that way? But then two, I don't know if you can see ways of changing that. I haven't gotten to the second part. I'm just trying to self-care, but any thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the things is I certainly have made errors. I try to ask for forgiveness. I try to learn from my mistakes. I'm not going to say everything correctly all the time. I'm not, even with my best intentions. That doesn't mean my best intentions are taken well. And I certainly have been the kind of person that wants to bring people together, and certainly not to offend. And I know that I have offended, but again, not with intention. So I think that if we can self-reflect, and if we have the possibility to go back to people and have conversations about, oh, I really get that this is what I said, and this is what I've learned, and I promise you I will try never to do that again. And, it's not really up to me whether I'm forgiven. I can ask for forgiveness, but I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. I have really wonderful allies, friends, family that have been my supports, continue to be my supports. But also there have been times, and I think this happens with many of us, that I've taken better care of the world than I have of myself. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And so it's being reminded that, okay, I'm going to take my walk today. I'm going to spend some time doing the things that I know nourish me. I mean, and what nourishes me may not nourish you. I love to watch. I mean, I have to kind of admit, it's kind of, I'm sometimes embarrassed to admit that I think I deal so much with trauma that I often watch the Hallmark Channel. And it's because that, almost every time it ends with a kiss. And it ends with people like self-reflective about something they've done that's been wrong and trying to, make amends. And it's a very simple show. It's definitely something that is not necessarily something that is designed by great thinkers, but there's so much kindness in it. And I just have to be reminded sometimes of the kindness and generosity that works in the world, and remembering the stories that I hear, like from, I've had this project in Ukraine for the last year, and I have learned to just love so many Ukrainians, a country that I did visit once in 2019 in Kharkiv. But I've learned so much from people suffering. And again, I even, kind of reflecting back to my own grandparents, and my mom coming here, and the bravery and courage, and what I hear from Ukrainians every day. I recently have been contacted by a group working with the Iranians, with what the women are dealing with there and the families are. I'm going to be doing a presentation for them at the end of the month. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be a woman in Iran right now. I mean, the bravery that it takes to walk outside your door, hoping that you make it to the grocery store. So I think about those things. I mean, I feel like I've been so lucky. I've had a lot of advantage, but I don't think I take my advantage for granted, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm hearing you say that there is, in restoring relationships, being able to connect and own your impact on others. I'm also hearing this idea of having empathy for their situation, as well as this piece of empathy for yourself, that we make mistakes and we're going to keep on making mistakes and we're not going to hold back. And then lastly, making sure we take care. And I love this the Hallmark movies you watch, sometimes cheesy.
I'm admitting.
Oh my gosh. Yes. And owning that. Because there's not enough, I don't think, goodness to be had in the radio we just open up. It's just so sensational that a good Hallmark is nice.
Well, and the other thing I'm thinking about is, Hallmark was recently taken over by a Black woman, and that there is so much more diversity, not only of, representing different cultures, but different gender identities. And they even had, they have people, LGBTQ represented And that's why some people have left, but I'm just going, yay, Hallmark, do that. We're moving into the modern age. And
I know, right? Hallmark is
embrace
like
diversity. But I get, there's another thing too, for the women out there that are thinking about, I have an idea, I want to start something. I remember, when you said, did I always know? One thing that did happen is that people would say to me, and I didn't experience it myself. And that was, oh, Elaine, you're always so outspoken. You're always saying what you think. I didn't perceive myself that way, which I think is so interesting because I was like one of the youngest delegates to the Democratic Convention in 1972. I think I was like 19 years old. But then I'm going, why was I chosen? Again, that not good enough. But I think to really reflect about, how do you show up in the world? What are people saying about you? Maybe you're not able yet to see your gifts. And so what would have been that young Elaine of 19, maybe if I would have had some people in my life then that would have embraced me and said, it's very normal to not feel good enough. And so, but to know that you are, and I'll be there for you. And if you want to talk about the times that you have wobbly feet, or there's a tightness in your belly, you're not sure if you should go forward, know that I am here for you. And I will embrace you. I'll walk behind you. You take the first steps, but I'm behind you. Like I can be a shadow. You're the light, and I can be the shadow, and I can be there to answer questions. I've been there before you, and I'm here to be behind you now as you take your own journey.
I love that. Oh my gosh. Because we can narrate for people, our children, our
absolutely
people who come after us, that it is normal not to feel good enough. And yet they are. And I'm here, however I can be helpful to shine light. Oh, so beautiful. With that, Elaine, I want to move to lightning round. Are you ready?
All right. Okay.
Chocolate or vanilla?
Oh, chocolate.
Cooking or takeout?
Takeout.
Climb a mountain or jump from a plane?
Climb a mountain.
Have you ever worn socks with sandals?
Absolutely.
So confident. I love that answer. How would you rate your karaoke skills on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being Mariah Carey?
5.
What's a recent book you read?
It's actually right on my desk. It's How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett, wonderful neuroscientist.
What's your favorite way to practice self-care?
Walking in the mountains in Johnson's pastures. It's above my house. Beautiful. Looks like Ireland.
What's a good professional development you've done?
I think one of the best ones I've done was the Myers-Briggs training.
What's your definition of a boss mama?
A boss mama? No definition. I don't want to be someone's mama. I want to be someone's colleague and be there together, or sometimes being behind saying, you can do it.
And what advice would you give your younger self?
It's going to be okay. We've been talking about you're good enough. Follow your dreams. Don't take what some men say to you as defining. You have your own way to define yourself in the world. And it's not dependent on what even others have done, but it's how you're synthesizing the reality that you're perceiving and how you might be able to make a better world. And you're going to be surprised at what's possible.
And then where can we find you? Like LinkedIn? Of course, you have your Resiliency Within podcast. Anywhere else?
Yes. And also, they can also find me through the Trauma Resource Institute. They can send me a personal email at elaine@resiliencywithin.com if they want to contact me. And going to the Trauma Resource Institute I think is a good place to go, because it shows the amazing work that myself and others have done and continue to do. And I know will continue to do after I'm dust in the wind.
And then last one, do you have a final ask, recommendation, or any parting thoughts to share?
I would just say that is giving yourself grace. Sometimes it's easy for us to give others grace and understanding and forgiveness. And could you just turn a little bit of that around for yourself and take in the advice that you give others and perhaps give it to yourself? It may be really helpful. All the wisdom lies within you. I guess that's what I've learned. A little lady, I'll never forget her, after the horrible typhoon in the Philippines. I was in Tacloban and we were sharing our skills with people. And one little lady said, "Thank you for reminding me what I already knew but had forgotten." I think that's a nice way to end.
That's beautiful. And with that, Elaine, much gratitude for all the wisdom and the stories. I feel like we could go on and on for hours, but I'm so, so grateful. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your impact. And thank you just for being you.
Oh, thank you, Analiza. It's a joy to meet you, and it was a joy to be here with you. Thank you for the conversation.